My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and for the last 8 years I had built almost every part of my life around one thing: my work. I lived in Chicago and worked as Senior Operations Coordinator at a fast-growing logistics technology company called North Axis Solutions. We specialized in managing supply chain systems for large retail corporations across the Midwest, handling everything from warehouse coordination to transportation planning and emergency inventory management. If someone had asked me what defined me back then, I wouldn't have said family, hobbies, relationships, or dreams. I would have simply answered my job. I had started at North Axis when the company was still relatively small. Back then, our entire operations team occupied only half of the fourth floor in an outdated office building downtown. There were no polished conference rooms, no expensive consultants walking around pretending to understand our business, no complicated layers of management. It was simple. We worked hard, solved problems, and grew together. I joined as a junior logistics analyst, mostly monitoring shipment schedules and updating inventory reports for distribution centers. I remember those early months clearly. The workload was relentless. Most evenings I stayed long after everyone had left, fixing transportation delays, negotiating with regional carriers, recalculating warehouse capacities when shipments arrived late. It was exhausting, but I loved it. My direct manager at the time, Daniel Mercer, noticed that very quickly. Daniel was one of those executives who knew exactly how to motivate people. He rarely complimented anyone, which somehow made his approval feel far more valuable when it finally came. I still remember the night he walked into the office at nearly midnight, while I was rebuilding an entire shipment routing schedule after a major system outage. He stood beside my desk, crossed his arms, and simply said, "You're dependable, Olivia. That matters more than talent in this business." Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. From that moment forward, I became obsessed with proving that he was right. Over the years, North Axis expanded aggressively. New clients, new regional warehouses, new contracts, new departments. And somewhere during all of that growth, I quietly became one of the most important people inside operations. I built internal scheduling systems that reduced transport delays by nearly 20%. I trained entire teams of new coordinators. I helped redesign emergency routing protocols after a severe winter storm had shut down half our regional delivery network 2 years earlier. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. I simply worked. And I worked harder than everyone around me. Sometimes too hard. People in the office joked that I treated the company like it was my personal responsibility. Maybe they were right. My social life barely existed. I had been divorced for almost 4 years. No dramatic ending. No betrayal. Just two people who slowly realized they no longer lived in the same world. My younger sister Megan occasionally reminded me that work had completely consumed me. She lived in Milwaukee with her husband and 2 children and called me every Sunday. Almost every conversation ended exactly the same way. Liv, one day you're going to wake up and realize your entire life happened inside office buildings. I usually laughed and changed the subject. At the time, I genuinely believed sacrifice was temporary. I believed if I gave enough of myself now, eventually everything else would fall into place. At North Axis, the position everyone talked about was Director of Regional Operations. It was one of the highest executive roles below the executive board. And for nearly 2 years, everyone assumed I would eventually get it. The current director, Robert Gaines, was preparing for retirement. Daniel had mentioned more than once during performance reviews that leadership was watching my progress closely. He always said the same thing. Keep doing what you're doing. Your time is coming. I believed him. Completely. By that point, my record inside the company spoke for itself. 3 consecutive years of exceeding department performance targets. 2 company leadership awards. The trust of nearly every warehouse manager across 6 states. Even senior executives frequently bypassed department heads and contacted me directly whenever operational issues appeared. I had earned my place, or at least I thought I had. Everything changed in early March. That Monday morning, I arrived at work around 7, earlier than usual. The office felt strangely energized. People were gathering in small groups near the coffee station, speaking quietly but excitedly. Something was happening. When I opened my inbox, I saw the company-wide email from Human Resources. Mandatory executive meeting, 10 a.m. Important organizational announcement. My heart immediately started racing. I already knew what this meant. Robert Gaines had officially submitted retirement paperwork 2 weeks earlier. This had to be it. The promotion. I sat at my desk for nearly 20 minutes staring at the screen trying to stay calm. For months I had imagined this exact moment. Every late night. Every crisis I solved. Every weekend spent answering emergency calls instead of living a normal life. It all led here. I even opened a blank document and started writing notes for what I might say if I needed to address the operations team. I wanted to thank the people I had worked beside for years. I wanted them to know we built everything together. At 8:30, my closest colleague, Hannah Reeves, walked into my office holding a coffee cup. She leaned against the doorway and smiled. "You look nervous." I smiled back, trying not to be. She laughed softly. "Everyone knows it's happening today, Olivia. I already told Jason I'm betting on you." "Don't jinx it." "Relax," she said. "You earned this years ago." I looked down at the note sitting on my desk. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel proud. Not confident. Not arrogant. Just proud. At 10 sharp, nearly every employee had gathered inside the main conference hall. I sat near the front. Daniel stood on stage wearing his usual dark gray suit, calm and perfectly composed. He began with the standard corporate speech. Growth. Expansion. Innovation. Long-term vision. I barely heard any of it. My pulse was pounding too loudly. Then he paused, smiled, and finally said, "Today marks an important step forward for North Axis Solutions. As we continue expanding nationally, we need fresh leadership prepared for the future." Fresh leadership. Something about those words immediately made my stomach tighten. Daniel continued, "I'd like everyone to welcome our new Director of Regional Operations, Ethan Caldwell." For several seconds I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The room fell silent. Then polite applause slowly filled the hall. A man stood from the second row. Young. Maybe 30 years old. Perfect suit. Confident smile. I recognized him immediately. He had joined the Strategic Development Department less than 6 months earlier. I had barely spoken to him twice. I stared forward while the applause continued around me. I couldn't breathe properly. Then Daniel looked directly at me and added casually, "Olivia will be assisting Ethan during the transition process. Nobody understands our internal systems better than she does." Something inside me went completely quiet. Not anger. Not shock. Something worse. The unbearable realization that 8 years of loyalty had just been reduced to a training assignment. And somehow, everyone in the room kept smiling. I stayed seated long after the meeting ended. People began standing, gathering around Ethan, shaking his hand, offering congratulations with the kind of enthusiasm people perform when they know someone important is watching. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt strangely heavy. Hannah turned toward me, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and anger. "Olivia, what the hell was that?" I didn't answer immediately. I watched Ethan smile as Daniel introduced him to department leads who had spent years building systems he had absolutely no understanding of. Then I finally exhaled. Apparently I've been promoted to teacher. The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Hannah stared at me for several seconds. This doesn't make sense. Everyone thought. So did I. I picked up the folder I had brought to the meeting, the notes I had spent nearly 3 hours preparing earlier that morning. Without looking at them, I folded the papers once and slipped them into my bag. I already knew I would never read them again. That afternoon, Daniel asked me to come to his office. I knew exactly what the conversation would be before I even walked upstairs. His office overlooked downtown Chicago, 20 floors above the traffic below. The same office where he had spent years convincing me that hard work was always rewarded. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Olivia, sit down." His tone was calm. Too calm. I sat quietly. Daniel folded his hands together. "I know this morning probably caught you off guard." "Probably." Interesting choice of words. "This was a strategic executive decision," he continued. "The company needs younger leadership with broader growth perspectives. Ethan brings a modern approach that aligns with where we're heading." I kept my expression neutral. I understand. He smiled faintly. I knew you would. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. I need you focused during this transition. Ethan has strong leadership potential, but he doesn't know operations yet. You'll help him understand the internal structure, warehouse management systems, vendor relationships. Essentially bring him up to speed. There it was. Not promotion. Not recognition. Not reward. I had spent 8 years building a machine I was now expected to hand over to someone else. You want me to train him? I want you to support the company, Daniel corrected smoothly. I looked at him for several long seconds. For the first time since joining North Axis, I saw him differently. Not as a mentor. Not as someone invested in my success. But as a man protecting decisions that served people far above both of us. Of course, I said quietly. I appreciate your professionalism. Then he stood, walked around the desk, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Exactly the same way he had done years earlier when he first earned my loyalty. You've always been the backbone of this company, Olivia. Backbone. Interesting word. A backbone supports everything. And receives absolutely none of the credit. I forced a smile. I'll do what's necessary. I knew I could count on you. As I left his office, my hands were shaking. Not from anger. Something colder. The feeling of suddenly understanding years of misplaced trust. That evening, nearly everyone had gone home by 6. I stayed. Not because I needed to work. I simply didn't know what else to do. The office after hours had always felt comforting to me. Quiet keyboards. Soft hum of fluorescent lights. The distant sound of elevators opening and closing. Tonight it felt completely different. For the first time, the building didn't feel familiar. It felt transactional. Temporary. Like I had mistaken employment for belonging. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Hannah stepped inside carrying 2 paper coffee cups. She placed one beside my laptop. Thought you'd still be here. I nodded. You know me too well. She sat down across from me. For nearly a minute neither of us spoke. Finally she leaned forward. You deserved that promotion. I stared at the spreadsheet still open on my monitor. Apparently somebody disagreed. No. Hannah shook her head immediately. This wasn't about qualifications. I looked up. What do you mean? She hesitated, then lowered her voice. You know who Ethan's father is? I frowned. No. Jonathan Caldwell. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Then it clicked. Caldwell Freight Systems. One of the largest transportation contractors in the Midwest. North Axis had partnered with them for years. Massive contracts. Millions in annual logistics agreements. I slowly leaned back in my chair. You're serious? I heard finance talking about it 2 weeks ago. Apparently Ethan didn't get hired because of experience. I laughed quietly. A dry, hollow laugh. Suddenly everything made perfect sense. Fresh leadership. Strategic decision. Modern vision. It had never been about performance. It had been politics. Hannah studied my face carefully. You okay? I looked toward the city lights reflecting against the office windows. I think I just realized I spent 8 years believing effort mattered more than connections. She didn't answer. Because there was nothing to say. The next morning I met Ethan for the first time as my new boss. He arrived exactly at 9. Perfect haircut. Expensive watch. Tailored navy suit. He stood confidently in the doorway of my office holding a tablet. Olivia. Yes. He smiled and extended his hand. Ethan Caldwell. I know Daniel said we'll be working closely together. I shook his hand politely. Looks that way. I've heard impressive things about you. I sat back down. I'm sure you have. He either ignored the tone in my voice or genuinely didn't notice it. Hard to tell. Daniel mentioned you built most of the operational systems currently running company-wide. Most of them. That's incredible. I'm looking forward to learning everything. There was something strange about him. He didn't seem arrogant. Not openly. In fact, he looked sincere. Almost nervous. That somehow made everything worse. Because I realized immediately. Ethan wasn't my problem. He was simply standing in a position someone else had handed him. The real problem sat upstairs in executive offices making decisions behind polished glass doors. I opened the system dashboard on my monitor. We'll start with warehouse network coordination. Perfect. For the next 4 hours, I explained every major operational structure I had personally spent years designing. Regional warehouse balancing, emergency rerouting systems, carrier prioritization, inventory forecasting, backup vendor systems. Ethan typed notes constantly, but after an hour, I noticed something concerning. He understood theory, not practice. There's a difference. So I tested him. Okay, I said. Imagine our Milwaukee warehouse suddenly loses refrigeration systems overnight. One of our pharmaceutical clients has temperature-sensitive inventory scheduled for morning delivery. What's your immediate response? He barely hesitated. Move inventory to another warehouse immediately. Which warehouse? Probably Indianapolis. Wrong. He blinked. Why? Indianapolis is already operating at 88% capacity. Additional intake creates congestion delays. He frowned. Okay, then Detroit? Also wrong. So what's the answer? I crossed my arms. You call the Wisconsin facility manager first. Then activate emergency refrigerated transport from our Green Bay contractor. Temporary relocation buys 12 hours while technicians repair on-site systems. Ethan stared at me. How do you know all this without checking data? I looked directly at him. Because I built the system. For the first time since entering my office, he stopped looking confident, and I noticed something unsettling. This man now held executive authority over systems he didn't remotely understand. Around noon, Ethan left for lunch with Daniel. I stayed behind. A few minutes later, a company-wide notification appeared on my screen. Executive Strategic Leadership Committee, updated members. I opened the list. Daniel Mercer, Chief Financial Officer, Senior Legal Advisor, 3 board members. Ethan Caldwell. My name wasn't there. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then my office phone rang. It was Hannah. Her voice sounded tense. Olivia, check your email. I already did. Do you understand what this means? I kept staring at the committee list. The answer formed instantly. This wasn't simply about losing a promotion. They were removing me from decision-making entirely. For years I had helped build operational strategy. Now I wasn't even allowed near executive planning. Someone upstairs wanted control concentrated elsewhere. And suddenly, I was no longer part of the future. For the first time in 8 years, I began wondering whether everything I had built inside this company was quietly being taken away piece by piece. And somehow, I had only just started seeing it. The following week felt different. Not dramatically, not in ways most people would notice. But after 8 years inside North Axis, I understood the rhythm of the company better than almost anyone. And I could sense when internal dynamics began shifting. Something had changed. And for the first time I wasn't standing at the center of it. I was being quietly moved aside. Started with small things. Project reports that normally landed in my inbox no longer appeared. Weekly planning meetings I had attended for years were suddenly canceled without explanation. Vendor negotiations that usually required my approval were now being routed directly through Ethan. No one officially said anything. No confrontation. No discussion. Just a silent restructuring happening around me. Like walls slowly being built while I was still standing inside the room. 3 days later, I decided to visit our primary distribution warehouse on the south side of Chicago. Normally, site inspections weren't unusual for me. I had personally helped design nearly every warehouse workflow currently operating there. The facility manager, Rebecca Torres, had worked with me for almost 5 years. She trusted me. The second I arrived, I noticed tension immediately. Rebecca met me near the loading docks holding a clipboard. Her face looked unusually serious. Olivia, I'm glad you came. What happened? She glanced around carefully before lowering her voice. They changed supplier routing protocols yesterday. I frowned. Who authorized that? Corporate. Corporate meaning who? Ethan signed off. Something tightened in my chest. What exactly changed? She handed me the shipping manifests. I began scanning the documents. Within seconds, I noticed the name. Caldwell Freight Distribution Group. I stared at the page. North Axis had always used diversified transportation vendors to reduce operational dependency. That system had been one of the first large-scale network structures I designed years ago. No single contractor controlled more than 15% of our transportation chain. It was intentional. Risk distribution. Protection against supply interruption. Now nearly 40% of regional transportation contracts had suddenly been reassigned. All to Caldwell Freight, Ethan's father's company. I looked back at Rebecca. When did this happen? Yesterday morning. Without operational review? She nodded. No one asked us for approval. I continued reading. Then I noticed something worse. Delivery windows had been shortened aggressively. Emergency backup carriers had been removed entirely. Cost-cutting. Whoever approved this wasn't prioritizing stability. They were maximizing contract volume. I immediately pulled out my phone and opened internal records. No notification. No strategic review documents. No compliance verification. Nothing. Someone had bypassed procedure entirely. Rebecca studied my face. Tell me I'm overreacting. I exhaled slowly. You're not. For the first time in years, I felt genuine concern. Not for my career. For the company itself. This wasn't politics anymore. Operational shortcuts create consequences. And consequences inside logistics don't wait long. That afternoon, I returned to headquarters and went directly to Ethan's office. He looked surprised when I entered. Olivia, everything okay? I closed the door behind me. Why did you authorize a 40% transportation transfer to Caldwell Freight? His expression shifted slightly. Not defensive. Uncomfortable. That decision came from executive strategy review. That wasn't my question. He leaned back slowly. Daniel approved it. And you signed it. Because that's what leadership decided. I stared at him. Do you understand what happens if one transportation provider controls almost half our regional chain? It improves efficiency. No. I stepped closer toward his desk. It creates dependency. If one carrier fails, the entire network collapses. We designed safeguards specifically to prevent this. For the first time since I met him, his confidence began cracking. Daniel said the old system was outdated. I almost laughed. I built that system. He looked away briefly. Look, I know you're upset about what happened with the promotion. The moment he said it, I felt anger rise instantly. This has nothing to do with the promotion. Then why are you coming after every decision I make? I stared directly at him. Because your decisions are affecting systems you don't understand. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to modernize operations. No. I shook my head. You're signing documents placed in front of you by people who know you won't question them. Silence. Heavy silence. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then he finally spoke quietly. Daniel told me you might resist changes. Of course he did. I suddenly understood everything. I wasn't being excluded because they no longer needed me. I was being excluded because I knew too much. That realization sent something cold through my stomach. Without saying another word, I turned and left. An hour later, Hannah appeared at my office door again. This time she didn't bother knocking. She stepped inside and shut the door immediately. We have a problem. I looked up. What happened? She sat down across from me. Finance department just flagged unusual billing activity. What kind of billing? Vendor contract inflation. I stared at her. Explain. She leaned forward. Caldwell Freight's new contracts are charging nearly 30% above standard market rate. That's impossible. Procurement would reject it. Not if executive leadership approves direct authorization. I felt my pulse beginning to rise again. Now pieces were connecting. Promotion. Executive restructuring. Vendor replacement. Committee exclusion. Direct contracting. No operational review. This wasn't random. This was planned. Carefully. And I had somehow been the one obstacle standing in the way. I stood immediately. I need access to procurement archives. Hannah hesitated. You won't have access anymore. What do you mean? She swallowed. IT restricted your executive permissions this morning. For several seconds I genuinely thought I had misheard her. Restricted. Daniel authorized access restructuring. I slowly sat back down. Now it was obvious. They weren't simply pushing me aside. They were isolating me, removing visibility, preventing oversight. And whatever was happening inside executive management, they didn't want me seeing it. That evening, almost everyone left by 6. I stayed again. Outside, Chicago was buried beneath cold March rain, streaks of water sliding down the massive glass windows surrounding the office. The entire floor sat nearly empty. Only security lights remained on. I opened my laptop and began reviewing old archived operational reports I had personally saved over the years. If corporate systems were now blocked, I'd work from my own records. 2 hours passed. Then suddenly something caught my attention. A series of old vendor comparison spreadsheets. One file connected transportation costs, warehouse capacity models, and projected vendor migration scenarios. I stared at the numbers, then recalculated manually, and my blood ran cold. If North Axis fully shifted distribution contracts toward Caldwell Freight under the new structure, the company would overpay nearly $18 million annually. No rational executive team would approve that. Unless profitability wasn't the goal. Unless somebody personally benefited from the contract structure itself. I leaned back slowly. For several minutes I simply stared at the spreadsheet. Then my phone vibrated. It was my sister Megan. I almost ignored it. But something made me answer. Hey, Liv? You sound exhausted. Long week. You've said that every week for 5 years. I closed my eyes. For some reason, hearing her voice made everything feel heavier. I think something's wrong at work. There was silence on the other end. Then she spoke softly. You mean bad management? No. I stared at the dark office around me. I think people are making decisions they shouldn't be making. Can you stop it? I didn't answer immediately. That question had been circling in my mind for hours. Could I stop it? Should I even try? This company had taken nearly a decade of my life. And now the very people I had trusted were quietly dismantling everything I had helped build. Megan finally said quietly, Olivia, don't confuse loyalty with obligation. Those words stayed with me after the call ended. 10 minutes later I made a decision. I reopened my laptop, created a private encrypted folder, and started saving every internal record I still had access to. Vendor contracts, financial spreadsheets, transportation reassignment approvals, committee restructuring memos, internal authorization chains, every document, every signature, every timestamp. I wasn't completely certain what I was looking at yet, but instinct told me one thing. Something deeply wrong was happening inside North Axis, and somehow, I had become dangerous simply because I noticed. Then suddenly, my office lights switched off. Automatic night shutdown. The entire floor fell dark except for emergency hallway lights. For a moment I sat completely still, watching my own reflection in the black window glass. And for the first time in 8 years, I no longer felt like an employee. I felt like a witness. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew this story wasn't going to end quietly. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I barely slept. Most of the night had been spent organizing the documents I copied the evening before, building a timeline of approvals, contract transfers, executive changes, and vendor restructuring decisions. By sunrise, one thing had become painfully clear. This was far bigger than I originally thought. North Axis wasn't simply favoring one contractor. Daniel had spent months restructuring the company internally so Caldwell Freight could gradually take control over nearly half our transportation network under inflated contracts. Every operational safeguard I had spent years building was being systematically dismantled. And Ethan, whether he understood it or not, had become the perfect cover. Young, inexperienced, easy to position, easy to blame if things went wrong. I walked into the office carrying my laptop bag like any other morning. But something immediately felt wrong. People were watching me. Conversations stopped the moment I passed. Co-workers who normally greeted me looked away. The tension was impossible to ignore. Halfway to my office, Hannah appeared beside me. Her expression alone told me something had happened. Daniel knows. I stopped walking. Knows what? Someone accessed restricted financial records last night. IT flagged unusual activity. Of course. I should have expected that. I exhaled slowly. How bad? Very bad. She leaned closer. HR scheduled a mandatory executive review meeting for 11. I gave a short laugh. Not nervous. Not surprised. Just tired. That was fast. Olivia. Hannah hesitated. Be careful. I nodded and kept walking. Inside my office, I sat quietly for almost 30 minutes staring at the skyline outside. For years, this room had represented stability. Everything I worked toward. Everything I sacrificed for. And now, strangely, I felt detached from it. At exactly 11, I walked into conference room C. Daniel was already there. Beside him sat the HR director, corporate legal counsel, and 2 executive board members. No one smiled. I sat down calmly. The HR director opened a folder. Olivia. Concerns have recently been raised regarding inappropriate access to sensitive company records. Corporate language. Polished and deliberately vague. I folded my hands together. I see. Daniel spoke next. His voice was colder than I had ever heard before. You've been creating unnecessary disruption during an important restructuring process. You mean asking questions? The lawyer leaned forward immediately. This is not a debate. We're discussing workplace conduct. I almost smiled. Interesting. They weren't denying anything. They were changing the subject. Classic strategy. Daniel continued. Multiple team members have expressed concern regarding your increasingly confrontational behavior with leadership. I stared directly at him. Which team members? No answer. Of course, because there were none. He leaned back. This company values professionalism and internal trust. That sentence finally pushed something inside me past the point of restraint. For nearly 10 seconds I simply looked at him. Then I reached into my bag. Placed several printed documents onto the conference table. Transportation contracts. Financial approvals. Vendor reassignment signatures. Everyone in the room immediately fell silent. Daniel's face changed instantly. For the first time, I saw genuine fear. I spoke calmly. Very calmly. Would you like to talk about professionalism? Nobody moved. I slid another document forward. 42% transportation reassignment directly to Caldwell Freight. Another page. Vendor pricing inflated 31% above market value. Another page. Unauthorized executive approvals bypassing operational review protocols established under federal transportation compliance requirements. The HR director stared at the paperwork. The lawyer remained completely still. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. Finally, he spoke quietly. You have no idea what you're talking about. I looked directly at him. Actually, I do. Silence. Heavy silence. Then Daniel stood suddenly. His voice sharpened. You've crossed a line, Olivia. I stood too. 8 years. 8 years of loyalty. 8 years of believing effort meant something. And suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. No. I stared directly into his eyes. You crossed the line months ago. I just finally noticed. The lawyer spoke immediately. Any external disclosure of confidential company material would result in serious legal consequences. I reached back into my bag, pulled out my phone, and placed it slowly on the table. That's unfortunate. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I held his gaze. It means I submitted everything last night. Nobody spoke. Not even breathing. I continued. Federal Corporate Ethics Commission. Another pause. Department of Transportation Compliance Division. Then finally, and an investigative journalist at the Chicago Business Journal. Daniel's face lost all color. For several seconds I thought he might actually collapse. The board members exchanged immediate glances. The lawyer began gathering documents. HR said nothing. I realized something strangely satisfying in that moment. Nobody cared about ethics. Nobody cared about right or wrong. They only cared once consequences appeared. Daniel finally whispered, "You've destroyed your career." I stared at him quietly. then answered with absolute certainty, "No." I picked up my bag. I stopped letting this place destroy me, and I walked out. No one tried stopping me. That afternoon, everything exploded. By evening, news outlets had already published the story. Corporate investigation opens into North Axis executive contract manipulation. The article spread fast. Industry publications, transportation associations, business media, internal investigation requests, federal audit reviews. Everything moved faster than even I expected. By the following morning, Daniel Mercer had been placed on immediate suspension. 2 executive board members resigned. Caldwell Freight publicly denied involvement. Ethan disappeared completely. No calls, no statements, no explanation. I spent the next 2 days at home. For the first time in years. Silence. No work emails. No emergency phone calls. No logistics dashboards demanding attention. I sat on my apartment balcony watching Chicago traffic move below and realized something strange. I had absolutely no idea who I was without work. For nearly a decade, career had become identity. Without it, everything felt unfamiliar. 3 days later, Hannah called. "You need to turn on the news." I opened my laptop. Daniel was giving a press statement outside corporate headquarters. Gray suit, forced smile. Same confident posture he had used for years. North Axis takes these allegations seriously. We remain committed to full transparency. I stared quietly. No apology. No accountability. Just corporate survival. 2 weeks passed. Then one Tuesday morning, I received an email from an unfamiliar sender. Claire Donovan, Chief Operations Officer, Meridian Global Logistics. I knew the company immediately. One of the fastest growing supply chain firms in the country. Far larger than North Axis. The message was brief. "Olivia, we've been following recent developments closely. I'd like to discuss an opportunity if you're open to conversation." I stared at the screen for almost a full minute. The meeting happened the following afternoon. Meridian's headquarters sat inside a modern glass building overlooking Lake Michigan. Everything felt different immediately. Open workspaces. No layers of executive isolation. No performative corporate culture. Claire greeted me personally. She was probably in her early 50s. Sharp eyes. Direct personality. No unnecessary formalities. She sat across from me and got straight to the point. "I'm not interested in what happened at North Axis." I frowned slightly. "You're not." She shook her head. "No." Then she leaned forward. "I'm interested in why someone with your position risked everything to stop it." That question stayed hanging between us. I answered honestly. Because systems fail when people stop caring how they work. Claire smiled slightly. "Good answer." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a formal offer. Vice President of Operational Integrity. Higher salary. Executive authority. Direct oversight across national transportation compliance systems. I looked up slowly. "Why me?" Claire answered immediately. "Because skill matters." Then after a pause. "But integrity matters more." I sat there for several seconds staring at the contract. And suddenly I realized something. For years I had confused loyalty with success. I thought staying silent proved professionalism. I thought sacrifice automatically guaranteed reward. I had been wrong. The real value of work isn't blind dedication. It's knowing what you're willing to protect when everything becomes inconvenient. I accepted the offer 3 days later. 6 months after leaving North Axis, I stood inside Meridian's National Operations Center watching teams coordinate logistics across 14 states. Hundreds of employees, thousands of shipments moving daily, complex systems everywhere. And for the first time in my career, I worked somewhere that trusted expertise more than politics. One evening Hannah called again. She had left North Axis shortly after the scandal. "You hear what happened?" "No." "North Axis filed for restructuring." I stayed quiet. She continued. "Daniel lost everything. Federal investigation proved contract fraud. Ethan testified against executive leadership." I looked out through the office windows toward the lake. The sunset reflected across the glass towers surrounding downtown. Strangely, I felt no satisfaction. Only peace. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through revenge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through truth, through consequences, through refusing to stay silent when silence becomes convenient. That night I stayed late reviewing warehouse automation reports. My new team moved around the operations floor below me, focused and efficient. No politics, no manipulation, just work done properly, exactly how it should be. I smiled to myself. I had spent years believing career success meant climbing higher. Now I understood something much more important. Sometimes success means walking away from places that ask you to betray your own standards. And if there is one thing I learned after nearly a decade inside a company that valued profit over integrity, it is this: work should never cost you the part of yourself you respect most. Because titles disappear. Companies collapse. People betray promises. But the way you choose to act when everything falls apart, that stays with you long after the office lights turn off. And this is how I finally learned that doing the right thing at work matters far more than keeping the job itself.